Hello everyone, welcome to The Missing Link. In tonight's mystery, we present the deadly London beer flood of 1814. A massive vat of porter burst in the heart of London, releasing a tidal wave of beer that swept through streets and homes, leaving destruction and unanswered questions in its wake. It's one of those stories that leaves more questions than answers, and tonight, you'll hear it all. Now, lie back, listen closely, and drift off as the mystery unfolds. You step carefully through the cobblestone streets of St. Giles, your leather boots finding purchase on stones still slick with an amber residue that catches the morning light like honey. 3 days have passed since the disaster, yet the sweet, yeasty scent of porter still hangs in the October air like a ghost refusing to depart. As an apprentice investigator for the Metropolitan Authorities, you've been tasked with documenting the aftermath of what witnesses are calling the Great Beer Flood of Tottenham Court Road. The Horseshoe Brewery looms before you, its red brick facade scarred by the violence of Monday's catastrophe. Workers move like ants around the damaged structure, their voices a low murmur that speaks of shock still settling into their bones. You pull out your leather-bound notebook, its pages crisp and expectant, waiting to capture the truth behind what many are dismissing as a freak accident. But you've learned to listen to the whispers that float beneath official explanations. Your mentor, Inspector Blackwood, taught you that accidents often wear masks, concealing intentions as dark as London's chimney-stained sky. The numbers alone tell a story worth investigating. 8 souls lost, including a mother and child, and damage stretching across multiple streets. Such devastation demands more than cursory glances and hastily scribbled reports. You approach the brewery's main entrance, where timber beams lie scattered like broken teeth. The massive wooden vat that once held 3,500 barrels of porter, enough beer to fill a small lake, now exists only as splintered remnants and twisted iron hoops. The force required to shatter such construction suggests something more deliberate than simple structural failure. Thomas Wells, the brewery foreman, notices your approach. His weathered face carries the map of a man who spent decades among the fermenting vats, but today his usual confidence seems as fractured as the broken wood at his feet. He nods toward your notebook with the wariness of someone who's already answered too many questions. "The inspector sent you, did he?" Wells asks, wiping his hands on a cloth that's seen better days. "Told him everything I know on Tuesday. The great vat just gave way. 22 feet high she was. Held more porter than most folks see in a lifetime." You study his face as he speaks, noting how his eyes drift toward the brewery's office windows rather than meeting your gaze directly. In your brief career, you've discovered that truth often hides in these small gestures, in the spaces between words where discomfort lives. The destruction extends beyond the brewery's walls. Across the street, houses stand like wounded soldiers, their foundations undermined by the rushing torrent of beer that swept through basements and ground floors with the force of a breaking dam. Mrs. Henderson's boarding house took the worst of it. 2 of her tenants never made it out of the cellar where they had sought shelter from what they thought was merely loud construction noise. You walk the perimeter of the disaster zone, measuring distances with careful paces, sketching the flow patterns that speak of water, or in this case beer, following the immutable laws of gravity and pressure. The liquid had cascaded down Tottenham Court Road like a brown river, carrying barrels, furniture, and tragically human lives in its wake. A child's wooden toy horse catches your eye, wedged against a lamppost and stained dark with porter. The sight sends an unexpected chill through your chest. This isn't merely about property damage or industrial mishaps. Real people with real lives and real dreams were swept away by forces they never saw coming. As you continue your examination, a pattern begins to emerge. The destruction isn't random. It follows specific lines that suggest the catastrophic failure originated from a particular point in the vat's construction. Your fingers trace the splintered wood, feeling for clues that might explain why 22 years of reliable service ended in such devastating fashion. You spend your second day examining the debris with the methodical patience of someone who understands that secrets reveal themselves slowly. The morning fog clings to the damaged buildings like smoke from a dying fire, and you find yourself grateful for its concealing embrace as you work. Something about this investigation feels different, more personal, perhaps, or simply more important than the usual reports of stolen goods and public disturbances. The brewery's ledgers, salvaged from the office, tell their own story. You spread them across a makeshift table in the courtyard, your fingers tracing columns of numbers that speak of profits and production schedules with mechanical precision. But it's the irregularities that capture your attention. Payments to suppliers that don't match delivery records, maintenance schedules that seem oddly sparse for such critical equipment. Master Cooper William Harrison approaches while you work, his leather apron still bearing the tools of his trade despite the fact that his services are no longer needed here. He's been crafting and maintaining the brewery's barrels for 15 years, and his intimate knowledge of wood grain and metal stress makes him invaluable to your investigation. The Great Vat wasn't due for inspection until December, Harrison tells you, settling onto a pile of salvaged timber. But I'd been watching her for weeks. Something wasn't sitting right with the lower hoops. They were showing stress marks that shouldn't have been there. You look up from the ledgers, pen poised above a fresh page. Did you report these concerns? Harrison's weathered hands fidget with a piece of metal banding, bending it back and forth as if testing its flexibility. Mentioned it to Wells more than once. He said the owners were concerned about production quotas. Every day that vat was down for inspection meant barrels not filled, profits not made. The weight of this revelation settles over you like a heavy cloak. In your experience, when money and safety compete for attention, money usually wins, often with tragic consequences. You make careful notes about the timeline, the warnings ignored, and the pressure to maintain production despite mounting evidence of potential failure. A movement in your peripheral vision draws your attention to the brewery's upper windows. A figure stands there briefly before stepping back into shadow, but not before you notice the fine cut of his coat and the gold watch chain that catches the pale sunlight. The brewery's ownership, you realize, is taking a keen interest in your investigation. You decide to examine the disaster from a different angle, literally. Climbing carefully onto the remains of a damaged wall, you gain a view of the destruction zone that reveals patterns invisible from ground level. The flow of beer hadn't been random at all. It had followed specific channels, almost as if guided by deliberate construction choices. The realization comes slowly, like dawn breaking over London's smoky horizon. Someone had known this flood was coming. The evidence lies in small details. A cellar window left conveniently open, furniture moved to higher ground just days before the disaster, and a boarding house tenant who'd mysteriously departed with all his belongings on Sunday night. Your notebook fills with observations that paint an increasingly disturbing picture. This wasn't simply negligence or even corporate greed. This was something more calculated, more deliberate. Someone had orchestrated not just the flood itself, but also its specific path of destruction. As afternoon shadows begin to lengthen, you notice another detail that sends ice through your veins. Among the salvaged items from Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, there's a collection of letters tied with ribbon. Most are water damaged beyond reading, but one remains partially legible. It's addressed to a Mr. Charles Whitmore, and the visible portion mentions arrangements proceeding as discussed and Monday's events will solve our mutual problem. The implications hang in the air like London's perpetual coal smoke. If your suspicions are correct, 8 people didn't die in an accident. They were murdered by greed disguised as industrial mishap. The flood wasn't a disaster. It was a weapon, wielded by someone who understood that the authorities would naturally assume such a bizarre catastrophe could only be accidental. You carefully wrap the letter in an oilcloth and tuck it inside your coat. Evidence this fragile requires protection, both from the elements and from those who might prefer it, never saw the light of day. As you prepare to leave the site, you catch sight of that same figure in the brewery window, watching your movements with an intensity that suggests your investigation is proceeding in directions that make certain people very uncomfortable indeed. Thursday morning finds you in the cramped offices of Blackwood and Associates, where your mentor maintains his private practice in addition to his official duties. Inspector Blackwood himself is a man who understands that truth often wears expensive clothing, and he's taught you to follow financial threads with the same diligence most investigators reserve for physical evidence. The letter you discovered has been carefully dried and pressed between sheets of blotting paper, revealing more of its contents. The correspondence definitely concerns Monday's arrangements and makes reference to insurance policies and property values. More importantly, it mentions a meeting location, the Lamb and Flag Tavern on Rose Street, scheduled for the Tuesday following the flood. Blackwood examines your findings through a magnifying glass, his grey eyes reflecting years of experience with London's more creative criminals. "Insurance fraud," he murmurs, setting down the glass and leaning back in his leather chair. "It's becoming distressingly common among the merchant classes. A convenient accident, properly timed and executed, can solve multiple financial problems simultaneously. You've spent the morning researching property records and insurance policies related to the affected area. The pattern that emerges is as clear as it is damning. Several of the damaged properties had recently changed hands or had their insurance coverage significantly increased. Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, in particular, had been purchased just 6 months ago by a company with connections to the brewery's ownership. The financial web grows more complex as you dig deeper. The Horseshoe Brewery itself was facing significant debts, partly due to increased competition from newer facilities with more modern equipment. The Great Vat, far from being a valuable asset, had become a liability, expensive to maintain, inefficient compared to newer systems, and requiring costly renovations that the company couldn't afford. But insurance policies covered not just the VAT itself, but also business interruption, third-party damages, and even compensation for victims' families. A properly orchestrated accident could transform financial ruin into profitable relief, with the added benefit of clearing valuable London real estate for more profitable development. Your investigation leads you to the offices of Hartwell and Sons, the insurance company that held policies on most of the affected properties. The clerk who assists you is nervous, frequently glancing toward the closed door of his supervisor's office as he reluctantly provides the information you request. The policies were indeed substantial, and several had been amended in the weeks preceding the flood. The afternoon brings another revelation when you visit the Lamb and Flag Tavern. The proprietor, a sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Garrison, remembers the Tuesday meeting clearly. 3 well-dressed gentlemen had occupied a corner table, speaking in hushed tones over their ale. She'd noticed them particularly because they'd insisted on a table where their conversation couldn't be overheard, and because they'd paid for their drinks with unusually large denominations. One of them was that Wells fellow from the brewery, Mrs. Garrison recalls, wiping down glasses with methodical efficiency. Recognized him from when he used to drink here regularly before he got promoted. The other 2 were gentleman types, fine coats, soft hands, the sort who make their living with ledgers rather than labor. She describes the men in detail that matches your growing suspicions about the brewery's ownership and their insurance partners. More significantly, she overheard fragments of their conversation, references to cleaning up loose ends and making sure the investigation stays focused on structural failure. The pieces of the puzzle fit together with the precision of a master craftsman's joinery. The flood wasn't an accident, it was a carefully planned financial crime that used 8 innocent lives as collateral damage. The perpetrators had counted on the sheer audacity of their scheme to provide cover. Who would suspect that anyone could orchestrate something so massive and destructive merely for money? But you've learned that greed, like water, always finds a way to flow around obstacles toward its desired destination. The brewery owners faced bankruptcy, the insurance policies provided an escape route, and the properties destroyed in the flood could be rebuilt as more profitable ventures. All it required was the calculated sacrifice of a few working-class lives, people whose deaths would be mourned briefly, then forgotten by a society that rarely valued the poor above property. As evening approaches, you realize your investigation has moved beyond simple documentation. You're now pursuing murderers who wear respectable faces and conduct their business in comfortable offices. The challenge lies in proving their guilt to authorities who might be reluctant to believe that gentlemen could orchestrate such a monstrous crime. The gas lamps begin to flicker on across London as you prepare to delve deeper into this web of financial murder, knowing that your quarry will soon realize their carefully planned crime is unraveling. Friday's pale morning light filters through your office window as you prepare for the most delicate phase of your investigation. Witnesses to crimes of this magnitude often carry trauma that makes them reluctant to speak, and you've learned that patience and gentle questioning yield better results than aggressive interrogation. The survivors of the beer flood have endured not just physical trauma, but also the bewildering experience of surviving something that sounds almost absurd when described to others. Your first visit is to Mrs. Eleanor Crawford, who lived on the ground floor of one of the damaged houses. She survived because she'd been upstairs mending clothes when the flood struck, but she lost everything else: furniture, personal possessions, and nearly her life when she tried to rescue her cat from the rising water. You find her staying with relatives in Bloomsbury, her eyes carrying the hollow look of someone still processing an impossible experience. The sound came first, she tells you, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that's grown cold while she speaks. Like thunder, but different, deeper, more solid. Then the wall of liquid hit our street, and I thought the Thames itself had broken free of its banks. She describes watching the brown torrent sweep past her window, carrying barrels, furniture, and debris in its churning current. But her account includes details that support your growing suspicions about the flood's deliberate nature. Someone had been moving through the neighborhood in the hours before the disaster, she recalls. A well-dressed man who seemed to be making notes and paying particular attention to cellar windows and drainage patterns. Your second witness is young Timothy Morrison, age 15, who worked as a messenger for various businesses in the area. His survival instincts served him well when the flood struck. He'd climbed onto a roof and watched the entire catastrophe unfold from above. His elevated perspective provides crucial information about the flood's progression and timing. It wasn't like water breaking free, Timothy explains, with the clarity that sometimes comes from youth observing adult disasters. Water spreads out naturally, finding the easiest path. This beer, it seemed to follow specific channels, almost like someone had planned where it would go. He describes seeing figures positioned at strategic points before the flood, people who seemed to know exactly when and where to position themselves for safety. One man in particular had caught his attention, someone who stood watching from the brewery's upper floor, checking a pocket watch as if timing the event. The most disturbing testimony comes from Mr. James Fletcher, a night watchman who'd been making his rounds when he heard unusual activity at the brewery in the early morning hours before the flood. He dismissed it at the time as normal maintenance work, but in hindsight, the sound suggested something more systematic, the deliberate weakening of structural supports rather than their repair. They had proper tools, Fletcher recalls, his weathered face troubled by the implications of his own words. Not the kind you'd use for fixing something, but the kind you'd use for taking something apart carefully. And they were working by lantern light, which struck me as odd for maintenance work. Each witness adds another piece to your increasingly dark picture. The flood hadn't been random or accidental. It had been choreographed with the precision of a military operation. Someone had studied the neighborhood's layout, identified the most vulnerable points, and timed everything to maximize both destruction and plausible deniability. But the witnesses also revealed the human cost of this calculated crime. Mrs. Henderson, the boarding house keeper, had died trying to evacuate her tenants. The young mother and child had been trapped in a cellar that flooded within minutes. These weren't statistics in an insurance ledger. They were real people whose lives had been expendable in someone else's financial calculations. As you compile these testimonies, another pattern emerges. Several witnesses mention the same mysterious figure, a well-dressed man who'd been observed in the area multiple times in the weeks preceding the flood. His presence suggests surveillance and planning on a scale that transforms this from simple insurance fraud into something approaching a military-style operation. The afternoon brings a breakthrough when Mrs. Crawford remembers an additional detail. The mysterious man had been carrying what appeared to be architectural drawings or blueprints, and she'd seen him consulting these documents while examining the foundations of various buildings. This suggests access to detailed information about the neighborhood's construction, information that would typically be available only to property owners, developers, or government officials. Your notebook fills with names, times, and observations that paint an increasingly complex picture of premeditated murder disguised as an industrial accident. The perpetrators had counted on the sheer bizarreness of their chosen weapon to deflect suspicion, but they'd underestimated the power of careful observation and methodical investigation. As evening approaches, you realize you're no longer simply documenting a disaster, you're building a case for mass murder. The challenge now lies in identifying the specific individuals responsible and gathering evidence that will convince authorities to pursue prosecution against what are likely to be wealthy and influential citizens. Saturday morning brings you to the heart of London's financial district, where the real architects of the beer flood conduct their business behind mahogany desks and leather-bound ledgers. Your investigation has identified a name that appears repeatedly in the documents you've gathered: Mr. Charles Whitmore, a property developer with connections to both the brewery's ownership and several of the affected properties. Whitmore's offices occupy the second floor of a respectable building on Fleet Street, where the morning light filters through tall windows onto maps and architectural drawings spread across multiple tables. You've arranged this meeting under the pretense of discussing insurance settlements for flood victims, but your real purpose involves observing the man whose name keeps surfacing in your investigation. Charles Whitmore proves to be exactly what you expected: a gentleman in his mid-40s with the soft hands and calculating eyes of someone who builds fortunes from other people's labor and misfortune. He receives you in his private office, where the walls display maps of London marked with various development projects. Several of these maps show the St. Giles area, with the flood zone marked in red ink. Tragic affair. The brewery disaster, Whitmore begins, settling behind his desk with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to controlling conversations. Of course, my company stands ready to assist with rebuilding efforts. These older neighborhoods could benefit from modern construction methods and improved layouts. You listen carefully to his words, noting how quickly he transitions from sympathy for the victims to opportunities for profit. His office contains several telling details: correspondence from the brewery's management, insurance documentation dated weeks before the flood, and most significantly, detailed architectural surveys of every building in the affected area. The conversation reveals Whitmore's intimate knowledge of both the brewery's financial troubles and the neighborhood's structural vulnerabilities. He speaks with the authority of someone who studied the area extensively, mapping out not just current conditions but future possibilities. His vision for the flood zone involves clearing away the substandard housing and replacing it with more profitable commercial developments. The old brewery vat was a disaster waiting to happen, Whitmore continues, seemingly unaware that his detailed knowledge of the vat's condition raises questions about his involvement. Those wooden structures simply weren't designed for the pressures of modern industrial production. Really, it's remarkable that such an accident hadn't occurred years earlier. But it's what you observe, rather than what you hear, that provides the most damning evidence. Among the papers on Whitmore's desk, you spot a document that makes your blood run cold: a detailed timeline of the flood's progression, annotated with notes about property damage and casualty estimates. This isn't a document created after the fact. It's a planning document, prepared before the disaster occurred. Your careful questioning reveals other inconsistencies in Whitmore's story. He claims to have first learned about the flood from newspaper reports, yet his office contains detailed damage assessments that could only have been prepared by someone with immediate access to the disaster zone. He professes concern for the victims while simultaneously discussing property acquisition opportunities with unseemly enthusiasm. The final piece of evidence comes when Whitmore excuses himself to retrieve additional documents from his safe. In his absence, you quickly examine the papers on his desk and discover correspondence that explicitly discusses the Monday arrangement and references payments to brewery personnel for cooperation with the planned structural assessment. When Whitmore returns, you've regained your composure, but your understanding of the crime has crystallized completely. This man didn't simply profit from the beer flood, he orchestrated it. The disaster was his creation, designed to solve multiple financial problems simultaneously while providing cover for what amounts to mass murder. The realization that you're sitting across from a killer requires all your self-control to maintain the facade of routine administrative inquiry. Whitmore continues speaking about rebuilding plans and modern development techniques, seemingly oblivious to the fact that his casual remarks about casualty estimates and structural vulnerabilities are confessions to premeditated murder. As you prepare to leave, Whitmore makes an offer that confirms your worst suspicions about the scope of this conspiracy. He suggests that a young investigator with your obvious talents might find profitable opportunities in working with progressive developers who understand how to transform urban disasters into community improvements. The implication is clear. He's offering you a choice between joining his operation or becoming another obstacle to be eliminated. You decline politely, citing professional obligations and departmental policies, but the offer lingers in the air like smoke from a freshly extinguished candle. Whitmore's smile never wavers, but something shifts in his eyes, a calculation that suggests your investigation has moved from inconvenience to potential threat. Walking back through London's crowded streets, you carry with you the knowledge that the beer flood was neither accident nor simple negligence. It was murder, planned and executed with the cold precision of a business transaction. 8 people died, not because of structural failure or corporate indifference, but because Charles Whitmore needed to clear valuable property for development and solve the brewery's financial problems in a single catastrophic stroke. The challenge now lies in proving these conclusions to authorities who may be reluctant to believe that a respectable businessman could orchestrate such an elaborate and deadly scheme. Monday morning arrives grey and persistent, much like your growing certainty about the true nature of the beer flood. You've spent Sunday organizing evidence and preparing for what you know will be the most dangerous phase of your investigation, confronting a conspiracy that reaches beyond Charles Whitmore into circles of power and influence that extend throughout London's commercial establishment. Your first stop is the offices of Hartwell & Sons, where you've arranged to examine the complete insurance files related to the flood. Mr. Edwin Hartwell, the senior partner, receives you with the nervous courtesy of a man who suspects this meeting will prove uncomfortable. The files reveal a pattern of policy modifications and coverage increases that began nearly 3 months before the disaster, far too systematic to be coincidental. These amendments to coverage, you observe, spreading the documents across Hartwell's polished desk, they all relate to properties in the flood zone. The timing suggests someone anticipated unusual risks to these specific buildings. Hartwell adjusts his spectacles repeatedly as he reviews the documents, his discomfort evident in the way he avoids direct eye contact. Our clients sometimes request coverage adjustments based on changing property values or business conditions. We're not in the position to question their assessments of risk. But the files contain correspondence that tells a different story. Letters from Charles Whitmore's development company explicitly discuss anticipated changes in property conditions and temporary increases in structural risks. The language is carefully crafted to avoid direct admission of foreknowledge, yet it clearly indicates that someone knew disaster was imminent. More damaging still is a memorandum dated 2 weeks before the flood, recommending accelerated processing of claims related to the upcoming incident in St. Giles. The document treats the disaster as an established fact rather than a possibility, using language that assumes rather than predicts the catastrophic failure of the brewery vat. Your afternoon visit to the brewery reveals additional evidence of the conspiracy's scope. Thomas Wells, the foreman who initially claimed ignorance about structural problems, becomes noticeably agitated when you present him with bank records showing substantial deposits to his personal account in the weeks preceding the flood. The payments came from a company controlled by Whitmore's development consortium. Those were consulting fees, Wells explains, but his voice carries the unconvincing tone of someone reciting a prepared excuse. Mr. Whitmore's people wanted technical advice about brewery operations for a project they were considering. Yet the consulting agreement you discover among Wells's papers tells a different story. The document explicitly discusses cooperation with planned structural modifications and ensuring proper timing of failure events. Wells hadn't been providing innocent technical consultation. He'd been paid to sabotage the Great Vat's structural integrity according to a predetermined schedule. The evidence points to a conspiracy involving not just Whitmore and Wells, but a network of individuals spanning the insurance industry, property development, and municipal oversight. The beer flood wasn't simply a financial crime. It was an attack on London's working-class neighborhoods, orchestrated by wealthy interests who viewed human lives as acceptable casualties in their pursuit of profit. Your investigation reveals how the perpetrators exploited the very systems designed to provide security and safety. Insurance policies meant to protect against disasters were manipulated to profit from deliberately caused catastrophes. Municipal inspections that should have prevented structural failures were bypassed through bribery and influence. Even the emergency response to the flood appears to have been compromised, with rescue efforts directed away from the areas where they might have saved the most lives. The human cost of this systematic corruption weighs heavily on your mind as you compile your findings. Mrs. Henderson died trying to save her tenants because no one warned her that her building was in the path of a deliberately created flood. The young mother and child perished in a cellar because someone had calculated that their deaths would help establish the disaster's accidental appearance. As evening approaches, you become aware that your investigation has attracted unwanted attention. A carriage has been following you at a discreet distance, and you've noticed the same face watching from doorways and street corners throughout the day. The conspiracy you've uncovered involves powerful people with significant resources, and they've clearly decided that your investigation poses an unacceptable threat to their interests. Walking through London's gaslit streets, you realize you've reached a crucial decision point. You possess enough evidence to expose the truth about the beer flood, but presenting that evidence will require confronting forces that have already demonstrated their willingness to commit murder for profit. The same people who orchestrated 8 deaths won't hesitate to arrange a 9th if it serves their purposes. Yet the faces of the flood victims haunt your thoughts. Ordinary people whose only crime was living in the wrong place when greed required their elimination. Justice for their deaths demands courage to match the perpetrator's ruthlessness, even if that courage must be applied carefully and strategically to avoid becoming another casualty of London's most calculated crime. Tuesday morning finds you in Inspector Blackwood's private office, where the accumulated evidence of your investigation covers every available surface like pieces of an elaborate and sinister puzzle. Your mentor examines each document with the methodical precision of someone who understands that justice often depends on the smallest details being presented in exactly the right sequence. It's comprehensive, Blackwood acknowledges, setting down the insurance correspondence and fixing you with his penetrating gaze. But you understand the implications of pursuing this case to its logical conclusion? Charles Whitmore isn't simply a businessman. He's connected to parliamentary members, municipal officials, and financial institutions that prefer their operations to remain unexamined. You've spent the morning organizing evidence into a presentation that transforms scattered clues into an irrefutable narrative of premeditated mass murder. The beer flood emerges as the centerpiece of a conspiracy that exploited London's industrial development for personal profit while treating working-class lives as expendable resources. The evidence speaks with devastating clarity. Financial records prove that Whitmore's development company purchased properties in the flood zone through intermediaries months before the disaster. Insurance modifications show foreknowledge of specific risks to specific buildings on specific dates. Payroll records demonstrate systematic bribery of brewery personnel, municipal inspectors, and emergency responders. Most damning of all is the discovery of Whitmore's planning documents, obtained through a carefully orchestrated search of his offices, authorized by a magistrate sympathetic to your cause. These papers reveal the flood's true purpose: clearing valuable London real estate for a massive development project that would generate enormous profits while eliminating undesirable residential areas. 8 people died to clear a building site, you summarize. The magnitude of the crime still difficult to comprehend fully. The perpetrators calculated that killing working-class residents would attract less attention than lengthy legal proceedings to acquire their properties through normal channels. Blackwood studies the architectural drawings that show planned developments for the flood zone, elegant commercial buildings and upscale residences designed to replace the crowded boarding houses and small businesses that characterized the area before the disaster. The drawings are dated months before the flood, proving that Whitmore's consortium had already designed their improvements to the neighborhood while planning the catastrophe that would make those improvements possible. Your investigation has also uncovered the broader implications of this conspiracy. The beer flood represents a new form of urban crime, systematic destruction disguised as an industrial accident targeting entire neighborhoods rather than individual victims. If successful, this model could be replicated throughout London's developing areas, transforming urban improvement into a weapon against the poor. The afternoon brings the culmination of your investigation when magistrates issue warrants for the arrest of Charles Whitmore, Thomas Wells, and 7 other individuals connected to the conspiracy. The coordinated arrests occur simultaneously to prevent the destruction of evidence or the escape of key participants. Your role shifts from investigator to witness as the legal system begins processing the massive case you've constructed. Whitmore's arrest at his Fleet Street offices provides a moment of satisfaction that feels almost anticlimactic after weeks of meticulous investigation. The man who orchestrated 8 deaths for profit maintains his composure even as constables place him in custody. But something in his eyes suggests he understands that his carefully constructed empire is crumbling beyond repair. The trial, when it comes, becomes a sensation throughout London as the full scope of the conspiracy unfolds in public testimony. Your evidence transforms a bizarre industrial accident into a calculated crime that exposes the darker possibilities of unchecked commercial development. The proceedings reveal not just individual guilt, but systematic corruption that reaches throughout London's business and political establishments. Yet the true resolution comes not in the courtroom, but in the quiet moments when you walk through the rebuilt streets of St. Giles and see new construction rising where the flood once swept away lives and dreams. The replacement buildings include a memorial to the 8 victims, ensuring that Mrs. Henderson, the young mother and child, and the other flood victims are remembered as more than statistics in an insurance ledger. Standing before that memorial on a crisp December morning, you reflect on the strange journey that transformed a routine investigation into something approaching a crusade for justice. The beer flood of 1814 will be remembered not just as a bizarre disaster, but as the crime that exposed how easily human lives can become collateral damage in the pursuit of profit. The faces carved in stone look back at you with expressions of peace rather than accusation, as if somehow understanding that their deaths, tragic as they were, served a larger purpose in protecting future victims from similar calculated violence. Justice, you've learned, doesn't always prevent tragedy, but it can ensure that tragedy serves truth rather than greed. London streets continue their endless bustle around you, carrying forward the lives and dreams of people who will never know how close they came to falling victim to a form of murder disguised as progress. Your investigation has ended, but its implications ripple outward like circles in still water, touching every corner of a city where human dignity must be defended against those who would sacrifice it for profit. You wake up to the sound of your neighbor's rooster crowing with what can only be described as existential confusion. Even from your hotel room window in Euro, Honduras, you can tell something's different about this Tuesday morning. The air smells like fish, which would be perfectly normal if you were staying near the coast, but you're smack in the middle of the country, surrounded by mountains and coffee plantations. You pad to the window in your pajamas, the comfortable ones with the little coffee cups on them that your sister bought you for Christmas 3 years ago. Outside, the cobblestone streets glisten with morning dew and something else entirely. Small silver shapes catch the early sunlight, scattered across the plaza like someone had a very specific kind of confetti celebration. Mrs. Esperanza from the hotel front desk is already out there with a broom, muttering what you're pretty sure are some choice Spanish words you didn't learn in your high school textbook. She's sweeping fish, actual honest-to-goodness fish, into neat little piles along the sidewalk. You blink hard, wondering if the altitude is getting to you. You're here as part of a cultural exchange program, supposed to be documenting local folklore for your university back home, but this wasn't exactly the kind of folklore you had in mind. The fish are small, maybe 4 inches long, and definitely not the kind you'd expect to find flopping around a mountain town. They look suspiciously like sardines, which is odd because the nearest ocean is about 60 miles away, and these little guys didn't exactly walk here. You throw on yesterday's jeans and a t-shirt, the one that says, "I'd rather be reading," because honestly, you would, and head downstairs. The hotel lobby smells like coffee and confusion, with just a hint of that fishy aroma wafting in from outside. "Buenos dias," you say to Mrs. Esperanza, who's now back inside, looking like she's seen this particular brand of weirdness before. "Ah, you're awake," she says in perfect English, which always surprises you, even though she's been switching between languages all week. "I suppose you've noticed our little situation outside." You nod, trying to appear casual about the fact that it apparently rained seafood overnight. "So, this is normal?" She laughs, a warm sound that reminds you of your grandmother's chuckle when you'd ask particularly obvious questions as a kid. "Normal? No, mija, this is not normal. But it's not the first time either." That catches your attention. You pull out your notebook, the trusty leather-bound one that survived 3 research trips and countless coffee spills, and flip to a fresh page. "It's happened before?" "Oh yes, every few years, sometimes twice in 1 year if we're lucky. The townspeople call it lluvia de peces, the rain of fish, but nobody really knows why it happens." She hands you a cup of coffee that's strong enough to wake the dead and probably sweet enough to put them back to sleep. You take a sip and feel your brain start to function properly for the first time since waking up to the rooster's identity crisis. Has anyone ever tried to figure it out? Scientifically, I mean? Mrs. Esperanza shrugs, the kind of shrug that contains decades of experience with inexplicable events. Scientists come, they take their measurements, they scratch their heads, and they leave. The fish keep falling. You look out the window again. A small crowd has gathered in the plaza, mostly locals with buckets and baskets, collecting the fish like they're gathering berries. A few kids are darting between the adults, squealing with delight every time they spot a particularly shiny specimen. "What do people do with them?" you ask. "Cook them mostly. They're perfectly good fish. A little gift from the sky." She pauses, studying your face. "You're going to investigate this, aren't you? I can see that look in your eyes. It's the same look my nephew gets when he's trying to figure out how to get extra dessert." You grin, caught red-handed. "Well, I am here to study local mysteries." After breakfast, which notably did not include any of the mystery fish, despite Mrs. Esperanza's gentle suggestion, you decide to start your investigation the way any self-respecting amateur detective would, by wandering around and hoping something interesting happens. The plaza is bustling with activity. Vendors are setting up their stalls around the scattered fish, creating an oddly festive atmosphere. It's like a farmer's market, if farmers grew their produce in the sky and harvested it from cobblestones. You approach an elderly man who's carefully selecting fish with the concentration of someone choosing the perfect avocado. His weathered hands move quickly, sorting the catch into different containers with practiced efficiency. "Excuse me," you say in your carefully practiced Spanish. "Do you know why the fish fall?" He looks up with eyes that have probably seen more lluvia de peces than you've seen rainy days. "Señorita, I have lived here 73 years. I have seen the fish fall maybe 15 times. Each time people ask why. Each time the fish don't answer." Fair point. You make a note in your notebook. Fish surprisingly unhelpful with explanations. "But," he continues, warming to the subject, "my grandfather, he had a theory. He said the fish come when the town needs them most, during hard times, lean seasons, like a blessing." You glance around the plaza. The town doesn't look particularly prosperous, but it doesn't seem desperate either. Just normal. The kind of normal that apparently includes periodic fish precipitation. When was the last time it happened? 2 years ago, maybe 3. My memory isn't what it used to be, but my stomach remembers the taste. He pats his belly contentedly. Good eating, these little ones. Better than the fish in the market, that's for sure. You thank him and continue your rounds, interviewing anyone willing to talk. The stories you collect are as varied as the fish themselves. Some people insist it's weather-related, strong winds carrying the fish from distant waters. Others favor more supernatural explanations involving everything from blessed rain to disgruntled river spirits having a particularly generous day. One woman tells you her grandmother swore the fish only fell during months with an R in them, which you dutifully record even though you're pretty sure May doesn't qualify. Another insists it only happens when the moon is full, though a quick check of your phone reveals last night's moon was decidedly not full, more like a cosmic semicolon than a proper period. By noon, you've filled 6 pages with conflicting theories and have developed a healthy skepticism about eyewitness testimony. You've also acquired a mild sunburn and a growing appreciation for your sun hat, which you forgot to bring. The town's small library beckons from across the square, its faded sign promising air conditioning and possibly some answers. You push through the heavy wooden doors and immediately feel 20 degrees cooler. The librarian, a woman about your age with kind eyes and the sort of organizational skills you deeply envy, looks up from her desk. "Let me guess," she says in English with just a trace of an accent. "You'll hear about the fish. Is it that obvious?" You have that look, half excited, half confused, completely sunburned. Also, you're carrying a notebook and you keep glancing at the window like you expect more fish to fall at any moment. She's not wrong. You have been doing that. "I'm Rosa," she says, extending her hand. "And before you ask, yes, I've lived here my whole life. Yes, I've seen the fish fall many times. And no, I don't know why it happens, but I might know someone who does." Your pulse quickens. In mystery novels, this is usually where the librarian reveals the crucial piece of information that cracks the case wide open. "There's an old meteorologist who retired here about 10 years ago," Rosa continues. "American, like you. He's been obsessed with the fish rain ever since he arrived. Lives up in the hills with about 3,000 books and a weather station that would make NASA jealous." She jots down an address on a piece of paper. "Tell him Rosa sent you. And bring cookies. He has a weakness for anything with chocolate chips." The drive up to Dr. Marcus Whitfield's house is the kind that makes you grateful for rental car insurance and question your life choices. The road, and you're using the term road very generously here, winds through coffee plantations and patches of cloud forest like a drunk snake having an identity crisis. Your rental car, a cheerful yellow compact that seemed perfectly adequate in town, wheezes and complains with each switchback. By the time you reach the address Rosa gave you, you're convinced the car is planning to file a grievance with its union. The house sits on a ridge overlooking the valley, surrounded by more weather equipment than you've ever seen outside of a movie about tornadoes. Wind vanes spin lazily in the afternoon breeze, and various electronic devices blink and beep with the dedication of robots monitoring the apocalypse. Dr. Whitfield answers the door before you can knock, which is either very polite or slightly unnerving. He's exactly what you'd expect a retired meteorologist to look like. Wild grey hair that suggests frequent encounters with static electricity, weather-beaten skin, and eyes that seem to be constantly checking the sky for incoming phenomena. "You must be the folklore researcher," he says, ushering you inside. "Rosa called, said you'd have questions about our fishy precipitation." His living room looks like a library exploded in the best possible way. Books lie in every wall, stacked on every surface, with weather maps and charts filling the spaces between. It's the kind of organized chaos that would give a neat freak nightmares, but makes you feel oddly at home. "I brought cookies," you say, holding up the bag you picked up at a bakery in town. His eyes light up like a child spotting presents under the Christmas tree. "Chocolate chip? Of course." "Excellent. Can't solve meteorological mysteries on an empty stomach." He bustles around making coffee while you admire his collection of rain gauges. So, what do you want to know about our little aquatic anomaly? You pull out your notebook, now considerably thicker than it was this morning. Everything, I guess. Is there a scientific explanation? He settles into a worn leather chair with his coffee and a cookie. Well, that depends on what you mean by scientific. There are theories, hypotheses, and educated guesses. But proof? That's trickier than catching the fish themselves. What's your theory? Water spouts, he says without hesitation. Specifically, water spouts that form over the Caribbean pick up schools of fish, carry them inland, and then deposit them here when atmospheric conditions are just right. It sounds plausible, which is somehow disappointing. You were secretly hoping for something more mysterious. But here's the thing, he continues, apparently reading your expression. I've been monitoring weather patterns here for a decade. I've got instruments that can detect atmospheric disturbances 3 days out. I've tracked every storm system, every pressure change, and every wind pattern between here and the coast. He pauses dramatically, taking a bite of cookie. And I've never detected a single water spout strong enough to carry fish 60 miles inland. The atmospheric conditions required would be substantial. We're talking about weather systems that would make headlines, not just dropping off some sardines and disappearing quietly into the night. You feel that familiar tingle of a good mystery deepening. So, what do you think is really happening? Dr. Whitfield stands and walks to one of his weather maps, pointing to a series of red marks scattered around the Euro area. These are all the documented fish falls I've been able to verify in the past 50 years. Notice anything? You study the map, looking for patterns. The marks seem randomly scattered at first, but then something catches your eye. They're all in the same general area, like a target zone. Exactly. If it were water spouts, you'd expect more random distribution, but these fish falls happen in a very specific geographic area, always within about a 15-mile radius. He returns to his chair, dunking another cookie in his coffee. There's something else too, something nobody talks about because it sounds crazy even by fish rain standards. Part 4. The Underground Connection. Approximately 680 words. Dr. Whitfield pulls out a thick folder from beneath a stack of meteorological journals. The folder is labeled Anomalous Precipitation Events in handwriting that suggests he takes his filing system very seriously indeed. What I'm about to show you, he says, settling back into his chair with the air of someone about to reveal state secrets, is the result of 10 years of very patient detective work and possibly too much coffee. He spreads out several photographs on the coffee table. They're aerial shots of the area, marked with different colored pins and what looks like geological survey data. Notice anything interesting about the topography, he asks. You study the photos, trying to see whatever pattern he's obviously seeing. The landscape looks typically mountainous, with the usual complement of valleys, ridges, and winding rivers you'd expect in this part of Honduras. I'm not sure what I'm looking for, you admit. Caves, he says simply. This entire region is honeycombed with limestone caves and underground river systems. Most of them haven't been properly mapped because, frankly, spelunking in Honduras isn't exactly a thriving tourist industry. He points to several spots on the map where small cave symbols are marked. These are just the ones we know about. Local estimates suggest there could be hundreds more, creating an underground network that stretches all the way to the Caribbean coast. You're starting to see where this is heading, and it's wonderfully ridiculous. You think the fish are coming up through underground rivers? It would explain the geographic concentration, he says, warming to his theory. Underground rivers could carry fish inland through the limestone cave system. When conditions are right, maybe during heavy rains that raise water levels, the fish get pushed up through natural springs and sinkholes. It's certainly more creative than water spouts. You'll give him that. But there's a problem with that theory too, he continues, deflating your growing excitement. The fish that fall here are all saltwater species, sardines, anchovies, and sometimes small herring. But the underground rivers in this area are all freshwater systems. Saltwater fish wouldn't survive the journey. You make a note. Fish mysteriously surviving impossible journey through freshwater caves. Your notebook is starting to read like a rejected script for a nature documentary. Dr. Whitfield stands and walks to his window, gazing out at the valley below. I've been thinking about this puzzle for 10 years now. I've measured, recorded, analyzed, and hypothesized. I've consulted with marine biologists, geologists, and atmospheric physicists. And you know what conclusion I've reached? That meteorology is more complicated than it looks. He laughs, a sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. That some mysteries are bigger than their explanations. Maybe the real question isn't how the fish get here, but why we need them to. That's unexpectedly philosophical for a man surrounded by scientific instruments. What do you mean? Think about it, he says, returning to his chair. This town has been getting fish delivered from the sky for generations. Free protein, arriving precisely when it's needed most. It's like having a cosmic grocery delivery service with impeccable timing. You glance at your notes from this morning's interviews. Several people had mentioned that the fish always seemed to arrive during difficult times, lean seasons, economic hardships, and periods when the community could use a literal gift from above. You think it's intentional somehow? I think, he says carefully, that there are more things happening in this world than our instruments can measure. Sometimes the most important truths can't be quantified or categorized. They can only be witnessed and appreciated. He offers you another cookie, which you accept gratefully. Mystery solving is hungry work. There's someone else you should talk to, he says. Maria Santos, the town's unofficial historian. She's been collecting stories about the fish reign longer than anyone. Lives down near the old church, in the blue house with the garden that looks like it could house a small ecosystem. He scribbles down directions on the back of a weather map. Tell her I sent you, and ask her about the pattern. Maria Santos's garden is indeed spectacular, a riot of color and chaos that makes you wonder if she's secretly negotiating trade agreements with the local hummingbirds. Bougainvillea cascades over her fence like purple waterfalls, while herbs and vegetables create a maze that would challenge even the most determined GPS system. She's waiting for you on her front porch, a tiny woman with silver hair and eyes that sparkle with the kind of mischief usually reserved for people who know excellent secrets. A picture of something that looks refreshingly cold sits on a table between two rocking chairs, as if she's been expecting you all along. Doctor, Whitfield called, she says, by way of greeting, said you wanted to know about the pattern. You settle into the offered chair, accepting a glass of what turns out to be the most perfectly balanced lemonade you've ever tasted. It's sweet, tart, and somehow manages to taste like sunshine and patience combined. What pattern, you ask? Maria rocks gently, her chair creaking with the rhythm of someone who spent many afternoons in contemplation. The fish don't fall randomly, mija. They follow the stories. This is the kind of statement that would sound completely crazy in most contexts, but somehow, sitting in this garden with lemonade and the scent of jasmine in the air, it feels perfectly reasonable. What do you mean? My grandmother told me the stories, just as her grandmother told her. The fish have been falling on Euro for at least 200 years, maybe longer, always in the same pattern, always following the same rules. She stands and disappears into the house, returning with a wooden box that looks old enough to have personal memories of the colonial period. Inside are dozens of handwritten journals, letters, and newspaper clippings, all carefully preserved and organized by date. I've been collecting these stories my whole life, she says, selecting a leather journal from the collection. Family histories, newspaper accounts, church records, every fish fall documented in this town for the past century and a half. She opens the journal to a page covered with neat handwriting and small sketches. Look at the dates. You study the entries, trying to find the pattern she's referring to. The fish falls seem to occur irregularly, sometimes twice in 1 year, sometimes with gaps of 3 or 4 years between events. I don't see it, you admit. Not the calendar dates, Maria says patiently. The story dates. Look at what was happening in the town each time the fish fell. She points to specific entries as she explains. 1943, the harvest failed, people were hungry. Fish fell 3 days after the priest led a prayer for divine assistance. 1952. The influenza outbreak left many families unable to work. Fish fell the morning after the town gathered to help the sick. 1967. The factory closed and unemployment was terrible. Fish fell during the town meeting where everyone was trying to figure out how to survive. As she continues through the entries, a pattern emerges that has nothing to do with weather systems or water spouts. The fish consistently arrive during moments of community crisis or unity, times when the town comes together to face difficulties or celebrate important events. It's like they're responding to something, you say, feeling slightly ridiculous for even suggesting it. Exactly, Maria nods approvingly. My grandmother used to say the fish could hear the prayers of the community, not individual prayers, but the collective voice of people united in purpose. She closes the journal and selects another, this one more recent. Yesterday's fishfall? It happened 12 hours after the town council announced they'd have to close the elementary school due to budget cuts. The whole community met in the plaza last evening, discussing what to do. The implications are fascinating and completely unscientific. You're documenting folklore, you remind yourself, not conducting a peer-reviewed study. But still, has anyone ever tested this theory? Maria laughs, a sound like silver bells in a gentle wind. How do you test a miracle, Misha? Some things are meant to be experienced, not explained. She refills your lemonade glass with practiced ease. But there's something else you should know. Something that might interest a researcher like yourself. Maria disappears into her house again, this time returning with a manila envelope that looks like it's seen better decades. She handles it with the careful reverence usually reserved for fragile antiques or sleeping babies. This came to me about 5 years ago, she says, settling back into her rocking chair. From a marine biology professor at the university in Tegucigalpa, she'd heard about our fish rain and wanted to study it. She pulls out several official-looking documents and photographs. Dr. Alejandra Vasquez. She spent 6 months here, collecting samples every time fish fell. Ran all sorts of tests, DNA analysis, species identification, age determination, the works. You lean forward, your researcher instincts tingling. This is the kind of scientific data that could either solve the mystery or make it infinitely more puzzling. What did she find? Maria sorts through the papers with deliberate slowness, building suspense like a master storyteller. The fish are exactly what they appear to be. Common sardines and anchovies, species found throughout the Caribbean. Nothing unusual about that. She pauses, selecting a specific document. But here's the interesting part. According to her analysis, all the fish that fall here, regardless of which year they fell, are exactly the same age, down to the week. That's odd. You make a note, though you're not entirely sure what it means. There's more, Maria continues. The DNA analysis showed something even stranger. The fish don't come from just any Caribbean population. They come from one very specific location, a small region off the coast near La Ceiba, about 60 miles northeast of here. She hands you a photograph of what looks like an underwater landscape. This is where it gets truly mysterious. Dr. Vasquez traced the DNA markers to a particular reef system, but when she sent divers to investigate the area, they found something unexpected. The photograph shows an underwater cave system, its entrance partially hidden by coral formations. It looks ancient and unexplored, the kind of place that might house sea monsters, or at least some very interesting fish populations. The cave system extends much further inland than anyone realized, Maria explains. The divers followed it for nearly 2 miles before they had to turn back. It connects to the same limestone formations that Dr. Whitfield showed you, the underground river system that runs all through this region. You're starting to see the pieces of the puzzle, though they still don't quite fit together. So the fish could theoretically travel underground from the coast? That's what Dr. Vasquez thought initially, but there's a problem with that theory too. Maria pulls out another document, this one covered with scientific charts and graphs. The fish that fall here are all caught at exactly the same stage of development. Young adults about 6 months old. but the journey through the underground system would take weeks, maybe months. The fish would age during the trip. She rocks gently, letting you process this information. Dr. Vasquez concluded that either the fish are making the journey impossibly quickly, or she trails off meaningfully. Or what? Or they're not making the journey at all. They're appearing here through some mechanism we don't understand yet. The garden seems quieter now, as if even the birds are pondering the implications. You sip your lemonade and try to wrap your head around the idea of teleporting fish. What happened to Dr. Vasquez? Did she publish her findings? Maria's expression grows thoughtful. She was supposed to return last year with better equipment and more funding, but then she disappeared. Disappeared? Not dramatically, Maria clarifies quickly, seeing your expression. She simply stopped responding to emails and phone calls. The university said she'd taken a leave of absence for personal reasons, but her research assistant told me she'd been talking about coming back to explore the cave system more thoroughly. She carefully returns the documents to their envelope. Which brings me to why I wanted to talk with you, Mija. Dr. Vasquez left some equipment here, underwater cameras, diving gear, and research materials. She asked me to keep them safe until she returned. Maria looks directly at you, her eyes twinkling with unmistakable invitation. I don't suppose a folklore researcher would be interested in a little underwater exploration? 3 days later, you find yourself wearing a wetsuit that's slightly too large and wondering how exactly you went from documenting folklore to preparing for what amounts to amateur cave diving. Dr. Whitfield has volunteered to be your surface support, which is reassuring since his weather monitoring equipment can presumably detect if you're about to be eaten by whatever lives in underwater caves. The entrance to the cave system is about a 30-minute hike from town, hidden in a grove of cecropia trees near a natural spring. The water is crystal clear and surprisingly warm, fed by underground sources that maintain a constant temperature year-round. According to Dr. Vasquez's notes, you say, adjusting your underwater camera, the cave system extends northeast toward the coast, following the limestone formations. She documented about 2 miles of passages before turning back. Dr. Whitfield checks his radio equipment one final time. Remember, you're not trying to solve the entire mystery today. Just see what you can see, document what you find, and come back safely. The fish will still be falling whether or not we understand why. The water is deeper than you expected, dropping quickly from the shallow spring into a proper underground river. Your waterproof flashlight illuminates smooth limestone walls carved by centuries of flowing water. Fish dart through the beam, small freshwater species that belong here, unlike their mysterious saltwater cousins that occasionally fall from the sky. You follow the main passage, taking photographs and checking your compass regularly. The cave system is remarkably extensive, branching into side passages that disappear into darkness beyond the reach of your light. After about 20 minutes of slow swimming, you reach what Dr. Vasquez's notes described as the anomaly. The passage opens into a large underwater chamber, its ceiling rising well above the water level. But what catches your attention isn't the size, it's the light. A soft blue-green glow emanates from somewhere deeper in the chamber, too steady and pure to be natural bioluminescence. You surface in an air pocket and find yourself in what can only be described as an underwater cathedral. Limestone formations create natural columns and arches, and the mysterious light transforms everything into an aquatic dreamscape. But the most remarkable thing is the sound, or rather the lack of it. The chamber is filled with a profound silence that seems to muffle even your breathing. Swimming toward the light source, you discover something that makes you forget every scientific explanation you've heard in the past week. The glow comes from a circular pool in the chamber floor, perfectly round and about 10 feet in diameter. The water in the pool is moving differently than the surrounding cave water, swirling in slow, hypnotic spirals that seem to follow their own physics. You photograph everything, though you suspect the images won't capture the strange quality of the light or the mesmerizing movement of the water. As you're adjusting your camera settings, something extraordinary happens. Fish begin appearing in the glowing pool, not swimming in from another passage, simply materializing in the spiraling water as if they're stepping through an invisible doorway. Sardines and anchovies, exactly the species that fall on Euro, swimming in confused circles before being caught by the current and swept toward the cave entrance. You watch, transfixed, as dozens of fish make this impossible journey from wherever they come from to wherever they're going. The process is silent, gentle, and completely inexplicable. After about 10 minutes, the glowing fades, the spiraling slows, and the chamber returns to normal cave darkness. You take several more photographs, though you already know they'll probably show nothing more than limestone and water. Some things, as Dr. Whitfield suggested, are bigger than their explanations. The swim back to the entrance feels different now, charged with the knowledge that you've witnessed something that will never fit neatly into a research paper or folklore collection. When you finally surface in the spring, Dr. Whitfield takes one look at your face and starts packing his equipment without asking questions. That evening, sitting on Mrs. Esperanza's hotel porch with a cup of coffee and your damp notebook, you realize that some mysteries are meant to remain mysterious. The fish will continue falling on Euro, the townspeople will continue gathering them gratefully, and somewhere in an underwater chamber, the impossible will continue happening quietly, patiently, and without need for human understanding. Sometimes the most profound truths are the simplest ones. The world is far more wondrous than we imagine, and that's exactly as it should be. The end. You settle into your favorite reading chair, a warm cup of tea steaming beside you as we journey back to Western Australia in 1932. Picture yourself as a newly appointed government clerk, fresh from the city, with ink-stained fingers and a head full of bureaucratic procedures. Your boss, a mustached fellow who smells perpetually of pipe tobacco, has just handed you the most unusual assignment of your career. Right then, he says, sliding a manila folder across your desk like it contains state secrets. We've got a bit of a situation out in Campion and Walgoolan. The farmers are, well, they're requesting military assistance. You flip open the folder, expecting to read about drought relief or perhaps equipment repairs. Instead, your eyes widen at the official request. Emergency deployment needed to combat large-scale agricultural threat. The threat, according to the meticulously typed report, involves approximately 20,000 emus. Now, you've seen emus at the zoo, those lanky, prehistoric-looking birds with expressions that suggest they know something you don't. But 20,000 of them? That sounds less like a farming problem and more like something out of a fever dream after too much Christmas pudding. Your task is deliciously straightforward. Investigate the legitimacy of this request and determine whether the Australian military should indeed declare war on a flock of birds. As you lean back in your creaky office chair, you can't help but wonder how exactly one goes about conducting reconnaissance on emus. The next morning finds you on a train heading west, watching the landscape transform from suburban gardens to endless wheat fields. Your traveling companion is a weathered farmer named Bill Mackenzie, who's been summoned to provide testimony about what the newspapers have started calling the emu situation. Started about 6 months ago, Bill explains, settling into the train seat with the careful movements of someone whose back has seen too many harvests. First, we thought it was just a few strays from the usual migration. Then more showed up. Then more after that. Before we knew it, the whole countryside was lousy with the things. You pull out your notebook. A proper investigator always carries a notebook and jot down the timeline. But as Bill continues his story, you realize this isn't just about crop damage. There's something almost orchestrated about the way these emus have descended upon the wheat belt, as if they've planned the whole operation. The strange bit, Bill continues, lowering his voice conspiratorially, is how they move. They do not move randomly, as birds typically do. They've got patterns, routes, almost like they're following orders. The train rocks gently on its tracks, and you find yourself sketching little emus in the margins of your notebook. Could birds really be that organized? Or was there something else at play here? Something that would explain why thousands of 6-foot-tall birds had suddenly decided to wage their war against Australian agriculture. As the afternoon sun streams through the train windows, creating long shadows that cover your notes, you realize this investigation might be more complex than anyone imagined. The farmers want military intervention, but first, you need to understand exactly what you're dealing with. After all, how do you solve a mystery when your primary suspects are flightless birds with attitudes and the collective intelligence of a parliamentary committee? The gentle rumble of the train wheels seems to whisper possibilities as you drift into contemplation, wondering what secrets await in the wheat fields ahead. Dawn greets you as you arrive in Campion, and the eerie quiet overwhelms you immediately. Usually, farm towns awaken to the sound of roosters crowing and dogs barking, but this morning's silence feels muffled, as if the landscape itself is retaining its breath. Bill Mackenzie leads you down a dirt road toward his property, pointing out details you might have missed. See those tracks there? He indicates a series of three-toed prints in the dusty earth, each one roughly the size of your palm. Fresh from last night, they come through after dark now, like they know we're watching during the day. You kneel beside the tracks, pulling out a measuring tape with the serious dedication of a Scotland Yard detective. The prints form neat single-file lines, stretching toward the wheat fields like a prehistoric conga line. But what catches your attention isn't the size or number of tracks, it's how deliberately spaced they are. These aren't the chaotic scratches of panicked birds fleeing predators. They're methodical, almost military in their precision. Your investigation leads you to Harold Ferguson's farm, where the damage assessment begins in earnest. Harold, a man whose sun-weathered face tells the story of 40 years working this land, walks you through what remains of his wheat crop. The destruction is impressive in its thoroughness. Not the random munching you'd expect from hungry birds, but systematic stripping that follows the property lines with suspicious accuracy. "It's like they've got a map," Harold mutters, kicking at a pile of wheat stubble. "They know exactly where my land ends and Peterson's begins. Peterson's crop? Hardly touched. Mine? Might as well have been harvested by a combine." You make notes about this selectivity, wondering if emus could possibly distinguish between different farmers' properties. The rational part of your mind suggests it's probably about soil conditions or wheat varieties, but there's something unsettling about the precision of it all. As the morning progresses, you begin to notice other peculiarities. The local dogs, normally eager to chase anything that moves, seem reluctant to venture near areas where emu tracks are heaviest. The horses in nearby paddocks cluster together at the far ends of their fields, ears pricked forward, watching the wheat with nervous energy. Your official government camera, a bulky contraption that requires considerable setup time, captures image after image of the evidence: trampled crops, scattered feathers, and those unnervingly organized tracks. But when you develop the film that evening in the makeshift darkroom at the local hotel, you discover something odd in the photographs. In several shots, you can make out distant shapes at the edges of the wheat fields. The dark silhouettes, which could be emus, appear to be standing in formation. Not the loose clusters you'd expect from foraging birds, but actual lines, like soldiers awaiting orders. The rational explanation is that it's a trick of light and shadow, but the pattern appears in multiple photographs taken from different angles. That night, as you review your notes by lamplight, a thought occurs to you that seems almost too ridiculous to consider seriously. What if the emu's behavior isn't random at all? What if there's some form of communication or coordination happening that goes beyond normal animal instincts? You set down your pen and listen to the sounds drifting through your hotel window. In the distance, you can hear them. Low, rumbling calls that seem to echo back and forth across the wheat fields like some primitive telegraph system. The calls have rhythm and pattern, almost like a conversation being conducted in a language you can't understand. Tomorrow, you decide, you'll need to observe the emus directly. But tonight, as you drift off to sleep with the mysterious calling echoing in your ears, you can't shake the feeling that you're investigating something far more complex than a simple agricultural pest problem. The emus, it seems, might just be smarter than anyone gave them credit for. Your morning brings an unexpected development: the arrival of Major G.P.W. Meredith, a professional soldier tasked with leading what everyone has started calling, with varying degrees of seriousness, the military operation. You find him at the local pub, studying maps over a breakfast of eggs and black coffee, looking like a man who's been asked to plan the invasion of Normandy but has only been given a slingshot. Major Meredith possesses the kind of military bearing that suggests he's accustomed to clear objectives and straightforward enemies. Watching him trace his finger along topographical lines while muttering about target acquisition and engagement parameters provides a delightful contrast to the reality of his situation. His enemy, after all, stands 6 feet tall, can run 30 miles per hour, and has the strategic advantage of not caring about military protocol. The challenge, he explains to you over his second cup of coffee, is that conventional tactics assume your opponent will behave in conventional ways. These birds, he pauses, choosing his words carefully, they don't seem to follow the usual patterns. You share your observations from the previous days, including the photographs showing what appear to be organized formations. Major Meredith examines them with the intense focus of a general studying enemy troop movements, which, you realize, is essentially what he's doing. Interesting, he murmurs, pointing to one particularly clear image. See how they're positioned? That's not random foraging, that's perimeter security. He looks up at you with the expression of someone who's just realized his job has become significantly more complicated. I think we may be dealing with an opponent that's considerably more sophisticated than anticipated. Your investigation takes a fascinating turn when the Major suggests a joint reconnaissance mission. Armed with binoculars, notebooks, and what he optimistically calls tactical snacks, you venture into the field for direct observation of enemy operations. The first emu encounter occurs around mid-morning, when you crest a small hill and find yourself looking down at approximately 50 birds methodically working their way through Harold Ferguson's wheat. But what you observe defies every assumption about random animal behavior. The emus have organized themselves into a clear hierarchy. Larger birds patrol the perimeter while smaller groups work systematically through the crop rows. When one of the perimeter guards spots your observation party, it doesn't flee or sound a general alarm. Instead, it makes a specific call, 3 short, sharp notes, and the entire group executes what can only be described as a tactical withdrawal. They don't run in panic, they don't scatter in all directions, they regroup at a predetermined rally point approximately 200 yards away, where they turn and observe you with the patient attention of professionals evaluating potential threats. Good Lord, Major Meredith whispers, lowering his binoculars slowly. They've got discipline. Your notes from this encounter read more like a military intelligence briefing than a wildlife observation report. The EMUs demonstrate clear command structure, coordinated movement, and what appears to be advanced planning. When the Major suggests moving to a different observation point, the birds anticipate the maneuver and adjust their positions accordingly. But the most unsettling discovery comes during lunch, when you notice something that makes you question whether you're dealing with simple animal behavior at all. While you and the Major share sandwiches behind a windbreak of eucalyptus trees, you observe a single emu approach from the direction of Peterson's untouched farm. This bird, clearly different from the others due to a distinctive pattern of darker feathers around its head, surveys the wheat field where the morning's group had been feeding. It walks the perimeter in a precise clockwise pattern, pausing at regular intervals to examine the ground. Then, in a behavior that raises the hair on the back of your neck, it begins making calls. The calls are not random emu noises. Instead, they follow a specific sequence. 2 long calls, a pause, 3 short calls, another pause, and then the pattern repeats. Within minutes, birds begin emerging from the wheat in response to what can only be described as a recall signal. Major Meredith has gone hushed beside you. When you glance at him, his expression suggests he's just realized that his military training might actually be relevant to this assignment after all. Well, he says, finally, packing up the remains of lunch with deliberate precision, this certainly changes the tactical situation. The next phase of your investigation requires more sophisticated surveillance techniques. Major Meredith, drawing upon his military experience, suggests establishing observation posts at strategic locations around the affected farms. You discover yourself crouched behind a water tank at dawn, equipped with field glasses, and a growing sense that this assignment has evolved far beyond simple agricultural assessment. The observations you make over the next few days will challenge the credibility of anyone who hasn't personally experienced them. The emus operate with a level of coordination that seems to mock every assumption about bird behavior. They conduct their crop raids with the precision of a well-drilled unit, posting sentries, rotating feeding groups, and maintaining communication through a complex system of calls and visual signals. Your detailed log entries begin to read like intelligence reports from some surreal military campaign. 0630 hours. Enemy scouts conduct a perimeter sweep of the Ferguson property. 0645. Main force advances in 3-column formation. 0700. Systematic harvesting begins, proceeding north to south in organized strips. But the most remarkable discovery comes when you realize the emus have developed countermeasures specifically designed to deal with human observation. On the third day of surveillance, you notice they have begun posting guards specifically to watch for human activity. When Major Meredith attempts to establish a new observation post, the EMUs adjust their patterns to account for the new position. They're learning, the Major observes, making notes in his field journal. Every time we change our tactics, they adapt theirs. It's like playing chess with an opponent who's getting better at the game. Your investigation takes an unexpected turn when you decide to interview Mrs. Dorothy Peterson, whose farm has remained mysteriously untouched despite being surrounded by devastated properties. Dorothy, a practical woman with the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who's spent decades dealing with the challenges of rural life, provides information that adds another layer to the puzzle. Started about a week before the big raids, she explains, serving tea in china cups that seem delightfully incongruous given the circumstances. A single bird would come by every morning, always the same one, big fellow with dark patches around the head. The bird would walk along the fence line, inspecting its surroundings before moving on. You lean forward with interest. Always the same bird? Oh yes, definitely the same one. Had a distinctive limp in the left leg. Would spend maybe 20 minutes checking the property, then head off toward the Ferguson place. Never touched anything, mind you. Just seemed to be surveying. This intelligence proves crucial to understanding the scope of the operation. The emus aren't simply responding to available food sources, they're conducting systematic reconnaissance and planning their operations accordingly. The deliberate avoidance of Mrs. Peterson's property implies that they are making strategic decisions based on factors you haven't yet identified. As you attempt to map emu movement patterns and predict their next targets, your evening analysis sessions with Major Meredith become increasingly complex. The Major approaches the problem with the methodical precision of someone trained in military intelligence, creating charts and diagrams that would look perfectly at home in a war room. Look at this pattern, he says, pointing to a map marked with colored pins representing different types of emu activity. They're not just raiding randomly, they're systematically working from the most isolated properties toward the more populated areas. It's a classic campaign strategy. Secure your flanks before advancing toward your primary objectives. The implications are both fascinating and slightly unnerving. You're not dealing with simple pest animals acting on instinct. You're observing what appears to be a coordinated campaign conducted by opponents capable of learning, adapting, and planning operations with remarkable sophistication. As you prepare your preliminary report for the bureaucrats back in the city, you discover yourself facing a unique challenge. How do you explain to government officials that the agricultural crisis they're dealing with may actually be the result of strategic action by an enemy force that happens to be composed entirely of large, flightless birds? The gentle evening sounds of the countryside, crickets chirping, wind rustling through wheat stubble, provide a peaceful backdrop for contemplating one of the most unusual military intelligence briefs in Australian history. Major Meredith's military equipment arrives on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a bemused supply sergeant who clearly questions the wisdom of deploying Lewis machine guns against agricultural pests. You watch as the Major methodically inspects his arsenal. 2 Lewis guns, ammunition, and various support equipment that seems impressively professional for what everyone still insists on calling pest control. The absurdity of the situation becomes apparent as you help establish the first firing position. Here's a decorated military officer applying genuine tactical principles to engage an enemy force of emus who have been systematically outmaneuvering attempts at conventional wildlife management. The Lewis gun, designed to stop German infantry advances, now points toward a wheat field where your feathered opponents are conducting their morning operations. The key, Major Meredith explains, adjusting the weapon's position with professional precision, is achieving effective target engagement while accounting for the enemy's mobility and tactical awareness. He pauses, seeming to realize how this sounds. I never thought I'd be applying suppressing fire doctrine to birds. Your role in this operation has evolved from bureaucratic investigator to something resembling a military intelligence officer. You've developed detailed profiles of EMU behavior patterns, identified what appear to be leadership figures within their groups, and created tactical assessments that Major Meredith treats with the seriousness usually reserved for enemy troop movements. The first engagement occurs on a crisp Wednesday morning, when a group of approximately 40 EMUs begins their systematic advance across Harold Ferguson's remaining wheat crop. Major Meredith positions his Lewis gun with careful attention to fields of fire and potential escape routes, while you serve as a spotter, tracking enemy movement through field glasses. Range approximately 300 yards, you report, feeling simultaneously ridiculous and genuinely engaged in the tactical problem. The main body of enemy forces is advancing in column formation with scouts deployed on the flanks. The Major opens fire with short, controlled bursts, applying textbook machine gun techniques to a target unlike anything in military training manuals. The results are unexpected. Rather than scattering in panic, the EMUs execute what can only be described as a tactical withdrawal. They don't flee randomly. They bound away in coordinated groups, maintaining formation discipline while moving at speeds that quickly carry them beyond effective range. Fascinating, Major Meredith mutters, making notes in his field journal. They've adapted their response to account for the weapon's characteristics. They're staying mobile and using their superior speed to maintain standoff distance. Over the following days, your joint military operation becomes an increasingly complex game of tactical adaptation. The EMUs, demonstrating remarkable learning ability, adjust their behavior to minimize exposure to the Lewis guns. They begin approaching target areas from directions that offer the best cover and concealment, time their raids to coincide with periods when observation is most difficult, and maintain security measures that would impress professional military instructors. Your daily intelligence briefings with Major Meredith take on an almost surreal quality as you analyze enemy countermeasures and develop new tactical approaches. The EMUs have begun using decoy operations, sending small groups to distract attention while their main forces conduct raids elsewhere. They have learned to identify the sound signature of the Lewis guns and can execute immediate suppression responses when they hear the distinctive mechanical cycling. They're getting better at these tasks faster than we are, the Major admits during one evening planning session. Every engagement teaches them something new about our capabilities and limitations. Meanwhile, we're still trying to figure out how to fight an enemy that can run 30 miles per hour and isn't concerned about conventional military doctrine. The situation reaches a new level of complexity when you discover that the EMUs have begun conducting night reconnaissance of your positions. Evidence suggests they're scouting your defensive arrangements and adjusting their operations accordingly. The tracks around your firing positions tell a story of systematic intelligence gathering by opponents who are taking the tactical situation seriously. As you settle into your evening routine of updating intelligence reports and planning tomorrow's operations, you can't help but appreciate the strange elegance of the situation. You're engaged in a genuine military campaign, complete with tactical planning, intelligence analysis, and operational adjustments, all directed against an enemy force composed entirely of large, surprisingly sophisticated birds who seem determined to prove that conventional military thinking has its limitations. The soft evening sounds of the Australian countryside provide a peaceful backdrop for what may be one of the most unusual campaigns in military history. By the end of the first week, it becomes clear that the Great Emu War has evolved into something unprecedented in military history, a sustained campaign between professional soldiers and an enemy force that learns and adapts with disturbing efficiency. Your daily intelligence summaries read like dispatches from some parallel universe where the rules of conventional warfare have been rewritten by opponents who can't read the manual. Major Meredith approaches the challenge with admirable professional dedication, treating each engagement as a learning opportunity rather than a simple pest control operation. His tactical notebooks fill with observations that would seem absurd in any other context, but make perfect sense given the circumstances. They've begun using terrain masking, he explains, during your morning briefing, pointing to a map marked with emu movement patterns. See how they approach from dead ground here and here? They're staying below ridge lines until the last possible moment, then using their speed to close distance before we can achieve effective target engagement. Your role has expanded to include what amounts to enemy psychological profiling. You've identified individual EMUs within the various groups, tracked their behavioral patterns, and developed assessments of their apparent decision-making processes. The bird with the distinctive dark head markings has emerged as a clear leadership figure, consistently appearing at the front of operations and seeming to coordinate group movements through specific call patterns. The tactical situation reaches new complexity when the EMUs begin demonstrating what can only be described as operational security measures. They've started varying their approach routes, timing their operations to avoid predictable patterns, and employing what appears to be counter-surveillance techniques when they suspect observation. Look at this morning's track analysis, you report, spreading aerial photographs across the planning table. They approached the Ferguson property from 3 different directions simultaneously, converged at a predetermined rally point, then withdrew using entirely different routes. That's not instinctive behavior, that's tactical planning. Major Meredith studies the evidence with the focused attention of someone trying to solve a military puzzle that doesn't appear in any training manual. They're applying principles of dispersed operations and multiple ingress routes. Whoever's coordinating their activities understands basic tactical doctrine. The Lewis gun engagements become increasingly sophisticated as both sides adapt to each other's capabilities. The EMUs develop techniques for approaching firing positions from unexpected angles, using natural cover to mask their movements and maintaining communication during contact. Meanwhile, Major Meredith adjusts his deployment patterns, varies his firing positions, and attempts to predict enemy approach routes based on terrain analysis. Your joint operations begin to resemble a complex military exercise more than agricultural pest control. You establish observation posts, conduct reconnaissance patrols, and maintain communication protocols that would be entirely appropriate for conventional military operations. The fact that your opponents are 6-foot-tall birds adds surreal elements but doesn't diminish the genuine tactical challenges involved. The breakthrough in understanding comes during your analysis of a particularly complex engagement near the Peterson property boundary. The EMUs demonstrate coordinated movement that suggests not just individual intelligence but collective problem-solving ability. When Major Meredith attempts to establish crossfire between 2 Lewis gun positions, the birds execute a flanking maneuver that effectively neutralizes his tactical advantage. They're not just learning, you realize, studying the movement patterns recorded in your field notes. They're teaching each other. Look at how the younger birds follow specific movement patterns established by the experienced ones. They're passing tactical knowledge through the group. This discovery adds an entirely new dimension to the campaign. You're not just dealing with intelligent opponents, you're facing an enemy force capable of institutional learning and knowledge transfer. Their collective tactical doctrine incorporates the lessons they learn from each engagement. As the sun sets on another day of this extraordinary campaign, you find yourself documenting what may be the first recorded instance of interspecies military conflict where both sides employ genuine tactical thinking. Your evening reports to the bureaucrats back in the city struggle to convey the complexity of the situation without sounding like the ravings of someone who spent too much time in the sun. The gentle evening sounds of the countryside, now familiar background noise to your strange military adventure, provide a peaceful contrast to the tactical complexity of your daytime operations. 3 weeks into the operation, the tactical situation has reached what military theorists would recognize as strategic deadlock. The EMUs have proven remarkably successful at achieving their operational objectives while minimizing their exposure to effective countermeasures. Major Meredith's ammunition expenditure reports make for fascinating reading. Hundreds of rounds fired, minimal enemy casualties, and a growing respect for opponents who have consistently outmaneuvered conventional military tactics. Your final intelligence assessment reads like a professional military evaluation of a peer competitor force. The EMUs have shown advanced teamwork skills, smart strategies, and security practices that have successfully countered most traditional military efforts. They've achieved their strategic objectives, access to agricultural resources, while maintaining force integrity and operational flexibility. The fundamental issue, Major Meredith explains during your final briefing, is that we're applying conventional military doctrine against an unconventional opponent operating in their preferred environment. They possess superior mobility, intimate knowledge of local terrain, and tactical flexibility that allows them to disengage at will. The recommendation you prepare for the government bureaucrats represents a unique document in military history. A formal assessment concluding that continued military operations against EMU forces would be tactically inadvisable and strategically counterproductive. The EMUs have essentially won through superior adaptation and the inherent advantages of operating on home territory against opponents constrained by conventional military thinking. Your journey back to the city provides time to reflect on the broader implications of your extraordinary assignment. You've participated in what may be the only military campaign in history where the human forces learned more than they taught. The EMUs demonstrated that intelligence, adaptability, and tactical thinking aren't limited to traditionally defined military forces. The final report you submit becomes something of a legend within government circles, a professionally written military assessment that recommends strategic withdrawal from operations against an enemy force of agricultural birds. The bureaucrats who originally assigned this investigation struggle to process recommendations that treat EMU tactical capabilities with the same seriousness usually reserved for human military opponents. Major Meredith returns to conventional military duties, but his tactical notebooks from the EMU campaign become unofficial, required reading for officers interested in unconventional warfare and adaptive enemy behavior. His professional assessment credits the EMUs with demonstrating tactical innovations that have applications for human military doctrine. Years later, as you've advanced through various government positions, colleagues occasionally ask about that business with the EMUs. You've learned to provide brief, factual summaries that avoid dwelling on the more extraordinary aspects of the campaign. Most people prefer to think of it as an amusing footnote about Australian wildlife management rather than a genuine military operation with tactical lessons for professional soldiers. But sometimes, during quiet evening moments, you return to those detailed field notes and tactical assessments. The Great EMU War represents something unique in military history, a campaign where unconventional opponents proved that intelligence and adaptability matter more than traditional advantages in equipment and training. The EMUs, for their part, achieved their strategic objectives and maintained control of their operational area. They demonstrated that effective military thinking isn't limited to humans, and that conventional doctrine has limitations when applied against opponents who don't acknowledge conventional rules. As you settle into your evening routine, perhaps with a warm cup of tea and the satisfaction of having documented one of history's most unusual military campaigns, you can appreciate the strange elegance of the entire situation. The Great EMU War proved that sometimes the most important lessons come from the most unexpected teachers. The gentle sounds of a peaceful evening provide the perfect backdrop for reflecting on a time when the Australian military learned to respect the tactical capabilities of large flightless birds who approached warfare with the seriousness of professional soldiers and the adaptability of natural strategists.